President of AAPI. And welcome to the fourth CME webinar this year. So we do have a very, very good speaker, Dr. Vijay Yaldandi, who is an ID specialist. And I know him for the last several years, and I've heard a lot of his talks. I've attended. He's one of the most eloquent speakers we have. And I would like to ask Dr. Amit Govil to introduce our speaker tonight. And Dr. Pankaj Kaul will be the moderator. At the end of the talk, if you have any questions, please post that in the chat box, or you can ask us to unmute you so we can, have you unmuted, and then you can ask questions. So, all right, Dr. Govil is the CMA chair. He's a professor at University of Cincinnati. So, Dr. Govil.
Yeah. No, thank you, Dr. Petula, for this, and Dr. Vijay Yaldandi, welcome, and thanks for doing this webinar. And Dr. Pamposhkal, thanks for moderating the session later on. As I was looking through the CV of Dr. Yaldandi, I just every line just meant something that was very impactful, and it was just almost impossible for me to summarize it well. He's so accomplished, and so Dr. Yaldandi is a clinical professor of medicine and surgery at University of Illinois, Chicago. He's faculty for Center for Global Health, University of Illinois, and faculty of Public Health Foundation of India, director of Infectious Disease Access, Health International. He's internationally recognized and has contributed a lot to HIV and COVID research, especially in India. And he established the Swarna Swasth Research Center in India as he did that in India. Multiple awards and recognitions over the years, and a very renowned speaker and an accomplished physician. And we look forward to your talk, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and I especially wish to thank AAPI for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that, I like talking about a lot. I've been talking about, the impact of HIV pandemic and what it would do to India and the world for many years. I should, start out with a little word of caution that most people find a lot of my ideas very provocative, and I don't expect everybody to agree with all of what I say. But I hope that I at least get you started to think about some of the things that I like to, dwell upon. So I'm going to try and share my screen.
Yeah.
Let's start. So the basic premise of the talk is, can we really predict pandemics, and can we prepare for it? So I hope that over the next few minutes, I will explain to you why I think this is not a very simple or straightforward proposition. In fact, it's quite hazardous. And perhaps we should be putting a lot more energy than we have into understanding how to deal with it, rather than focusing primarily on the prediction part. So now human evolution is a rich kaleidoscopic tapestry of advancing social and technical accomplishments, but they are periodically buffeted by catastrophic climatic events as well as disease pandemics. And this is why it's so important to study history. It helps us understand what's going on today or has happened in the recent past, and maybe we get some ideas about how to prepare for the future. So let's look at what hominoids, and this I include, apart from Homo sapiens, the others that we now understand also were present. Say, for example, the Neanderthals or the Denisovans and so on and so forth. Now we understand that there are multiple hominoid species, and we probably today are the inheritors of that complex interplay between all of those hominoid species. And today we consider ourselves one species of Homo sapiens. Well, I'm not going to get into those debates, but let's look at at least one major catastrophic event we know about, which is the super volcanic eruption of the Toba volcano in the current Lake Toba of Sumatra. It's thought to have occurred approximately 70,000 to 74,000 years ago. It devastated the entire planet. It deposited 5 centimeters of ash on the Indian subcontinent, caused a global winter lasting 6 to 7 years, and had a lingering climatic effect for probably around 1,500 years. The total population of humans may have fallen to less than 10,000. And not just humans, all hominoids. So that's like more than a 90% reduction of the population. So it's one of the earliest examples of a complete demographic collapse. And since then, with regular periodicity, 50 to 150 years, the first historical plague that we know about is the Antonine plague in 165 to 180 AD. And this is probably either smallpox or measles, followed by the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis in 541, 542 AD, then the Black Death of the Middle Ages. Then the Americas experiencing a major pandemic, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, in the 1500s, killing millions of the indigenous people. The third cholera epidemic, and by the way, cholera epidemics have been numerous throughout history, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, because cholera was always endemic to the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent. The Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, Asian flu in 57, 58, the HIV pandemic, which we think really became a horrendous pandemic in the 80s onwards. I saw my first case of AIDS in 1983. The H1N1 Spanish swine flu pandemic, then Ebola outbreaks, which have occurred several times all the way from 2014, 2016, most recently, but throughout history we've had several outbreaks in the African continent, Ebola, Marburg, and so on and so forth. And finally, the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic is particularly special because everybody has been touched by it in one way or another throughout the entire world. The other interesting thing is that a lot of outbreaks are associated with environmental disasters, floods, drought, earthquakes, hurricanes, and very interestingly, soon following all of these climatic or environmental catastrophes, there have been outbreaks of infectious diseases like polio, malaria, leptospirosis, cocci, West Nile virus, and so on and so forth. So, a lot of infectious diseases have caused epidemics or minor epidemics or outbreaks immediately following an environmental disaster. So what about the 21st century? And we've started the 21st century with SARS and H5N1, epidemics and pandemics that I'm talking about over here. Subsequently, H1N1, cholera, MERS, H7N9, Ebola, plague, yellow fever, COVID-19, and now most recently the Mpox. Okay. This has led to several international responses, starting with the Vaccine Alliance to the international health regulations and the global health security agenda and so on and so forth. And basically, these are examples of many different countries coming together, agreeing upon a common set of guidelines and actions to help control inter-country spread or cross-country spread of infectious diseases, and then collaborating together to help each other out in controlling or mitigating the effects of the outbreaks. What about the impact? So the SARS impact was $40 billion worldwide. The Ebola outbreak in Africa, most recently, 2014, 2016, the impact was $2.8 billion. But look at COVID-19. To date, it's $13.8 trillion of the cumulative output or loss. It's an astounding figure. And it's understandable because in our own lifetimes, all of us have seen this. We have all been touched by it directly, indirectly, both in medical terms, but also in socioeconomic terms. So let me go back to a book that I read more than 30 years ago, Plagues and Peoples. And this is a quote that I really like. And this is by William McNeill, who used to be at the University of Chicago. And he says, and I quote, "Ingenuity, knowledge, and organization alter but cannot cancel humanity's vulnerability to invasion by parasitic forms of life. Infectious diseases, which antedated the emergence of humankind, will last as long as humanity itself and will surely remain, as it has been hitherto, one of the fundamental parameters and determinants of human history." So early in my career, I was a little bit of a history buff, and I was fascinated by how the Spanish came to the Americas and conquered the Americas, Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, all of Latin America. And it amazed me to see how the native population, who had a very sophisticated culture, by the way, the pyramids they built were monumental, much larger and grander in scale than anything that Europe had ever built up until that time. Very advanced engineering, mathematics, hydrology, astronomy. Their calendar was far more advanced than what the Europeans had managed to bring about. And yet, these Spaniards, just a few hundred of them, under Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro, who were, by the way, barbaric people, not particularly well educated. In fact, they smelled so bad that the native Indians used to cover their nose with some scented material to avoid the stench that emanated from the bodies of these Spaniards. All right. Now, when they came, the Aztec Empire had a population of more than 24 million, the Incas around 12 million. The armies were tens of thousands of warriors. And I thought, when I was young, that of course the Spaniards brought with them firearms. And that's how their technological superiority enabled them to win against the native Indians who had never seen firearms and had never seen war horses, by the way. Horses were not native to the Americas in those days. But the reality is these primitive muzzle-loading guns with their flintlocks were far more likely to injure the person handling the weapon than the enemy it was aimed at. By the time the weapon was reloaded and ready to fire, the opponent could easily run up and use a machete to behead the gunman. All right. And yet, look at what happened to the population of the Aztecs. Over 20 million, and in about 50 years, they were under 2 million. The Incas, over 12 million, and once again, under 1 million in 50 years. And then they never recovered after that, even in the next 100 years. So this is an example of what we call demographic collapse. And the reason is quite simple. The Spanish conquistadors brought infectious diseases more lethal than firearms in the Americas. But also what contributed was the environmental degradation due to unsustainable farming practices. And when all of this resulted in great hardship in the population, the elite, they increasingly relied on human sacrifices, ritual human sacrifices to propitiate the gods. And this oppressive elite caused splintering of social cohesiveness and eventually led to chaos and a demographic collapse. Now, very interestingly, this is a theme that recurs throughout human history. If you read the Dawn of Everything, A History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow, they point to the same thing, that so throughout history, human civilizations have oscillated between primarily agriculture, pastoral, to coming together in urban areas to build monumental structures. In the old days, it was the megalithic structures, um, for example, that of Stonehenge, or more recently, we've seen massive excavations at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, more than 12,000 years old, massive structures. And then they abandoned them. So what happens throughout human history is that humanity, social structures come together. They build these huge urban civilizations. And then over a period of time, something happens with these urban civilizations. Perhaps it's disease, perhaps it's over farming. And there is this civilization, which is no longer sustainable, is then abandoned. And people go back to their farms in the villages or the forests and so on and so forth. And this is a theme that recurs throughout history. Look at the great river valley civilizations of prehistoric India, the Indus, and now what people call the Saraswati Valley civilization. It's very clear from the excavations that these were very sophisticated urban civilizations, really marvelous hydroengineering, sanitary canals, and so on and so forth. But they were all destroyed. And Malati Shengde, in her book, The Civilized Demons of the Harappans of Rigveda, suggests that there was internecine warfare between the urban civilizations of Harappa or the Saraswati Valley civilizations and another group who called themselves the Devas. And one of their leaders in particular, Indra, is credited with destroying the civilization by destroying all of their dams. So in the Rig Veda, this is described as Indra fighting the Ritras. The Ritra is a mythopoesis of the people who protected these dams. So Ritra is described as a demon in the Rig Veda. And Paul Ewald has suggested that additional coup de grace was that when all of these dams were destroyed and the cities were flooded by untimely floods, it must have brought about also epidemics of cholera. And finally, because of tectonic plate changes and drying up of the rivers of Saraswati, the population essentially fled. They all left the rich, very sophisticated urban civilization and moved away, migrated out. So now in India, in the Indian basin, the river basins, cholera has always been endemic. We've had multiple outbreaks of cholera in the Indo-Gangetic plains, the Brahmaputra river system, and so on and so forth. And even today, we find that all of our rivers are polluted massively, in part due to industrial effluents. And obviously, this cannot lead to anything good coming out of it. It's a cautionary tale that we need to look at. What this leads to is a great deal of environmental degradation and very severe affliction of populations that now live in slums. And these populations are particularly vulnerable to any kind of outbreak, particularly cholera that moves out of these river systems. Now let's come to something much more understandable, tuberculosis and the Industrial Revolution. Interestingly, what happened in the 1800s was that Europe was undergoing a mini ice age. What that meant is that farm productivity fell precipitously, and the population in the rural areas could no longer subsist on farming alone. There wasn't adequate food production. So they had to migrate to other places to seek a livelihood. And at the same time, pari passu, the Industrial Revolution hit, which meant that a very concentrated congregation of humans in urban centers developed these factories. Unfortunately, these factories were very densely packed, had very poor ventilation, were not adequately heated. But layered on top of this was a rather poor social practice, which is that in these factories, the workers were paid very, very little. So typically a worker in this factory worked about 16 hours per day with no weekends and 1 day off for Christmas. The wage was so low that one worker could feed only himself, which meant that the man worked, his wife worked, and his children also worked in the same factory. Now, you can imagine that if in this condition, a malnourished child developed tuberculosis, it would quickly spread to the entire group of workers in that factory. So there was an explosive increase in tuberculosis. 10% of the deaths were due to tuberculosis. In urban population of that area, 25% of adult working class died of pneumonias. Now, that's impossible to tell how many of those pneumonias were tuberculosis, but obviously at least some of them must have been tuberculosis. So in 1904, for which we have some reasonably reliable statistics, the rate of tuberculosis and deaths was 188 per 100,000. This fell in 1920 to 100 per 100,000. In 55, it fell to less than 10 per 100,000. And when I present these statistics to most of my trainees and ask them for the reason for that decline, the answer I often get is anti-tuberculous chemotherapy. The reality is that the first available anti-tuberculous drug did not come about till 1948, which is when streptomycin was used. And really, we did not have drugs like isoniazid and rifampin until the late 60s and early 70s. So tuberculosis had declined long before that. And the reason it declined really was labor law reform, which meant that child labor was abolished. People were to work no more than 40 hours a week. And also the working conditions were improved by law. So adequate ventilation and the minimum wage meant that the nutritional status of the population went up. And therefore, the resistance to disease and recovery was improved. Now, pretty much the same thing is happening in India, and I will show you some statistics here. Let's look at Dharavi. Now, Dharavi is one of the densest slums in the entire world. In just over 500 acres, we have 1 million people living there, and about 60% of them are migratory. All right. Now, I have not been inside Dharavi because I could not, but I've been close to the periphery of Dharavi, and my staff who have been inside Dharavi tell me that in broad daylight, they have to use a torchlight to navigate through those narrow, very narrow lanes because the buildings are 2-3 stories high and sunlight doesn't penetrate down or to the ground, all right? So within this population, amazingly, this is a population where the literacy rate is 70%. They're quite well educated. It's probably the best educated slum in the entire world. Their gross domestic product per year is about $1 billion. That's a billion with a B. So it's not exactly, what you would think about a slum as really poor people, and uneducated people. These are educated people, but they're all dependent on this area for their livelihood. And when COVID hit, oh my God, it was a catastrophe because we had been working in Dharavi to provide treatment for people with multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis as well as extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. So it was my staff that would track down all of these people and ensure that they have all been on treatment, address their adverse effects, and so on and so forth. But when COVID hit, it was a huge problem because of the travel restrictions. My staff couldn't go into these areas. So they had to rely on technology. So they relied on cell phones. They tracked down people with cell phones, tracked down people's families by cell phones, tracked down when people had migrated back to their villages, and ensured that 98% of these people continue to have access to anti-tuberculous drugs, whether they were in Dharavi or they had migrated back to their villages. But Compounding this entire problem was the problem of lack of livelihood and therefore lack of food. So once again, my staff had to swing in and recruit all the NGOs out there that were working in Dharavi, and some of these NGOs were providing food assistance. So we hooked up all of these people to food assistance to ensure that they could survive the entire pandemic. There were people who were living in their own cars, for example. So all of this is published, and you can see that retaining patients with drug-resistant tuberculosis during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was in MMWR. And then subsequently, we have published the same data or similar data about managing to control the pandemic by looking at household contacts of tuberculosis, right, in Mumbai. And this has been published in Frontiers in Tuberculosis. So these are the Share India projects addressing tuberculosis in Dharavi. So again, what we say is that infectious disease outbreaks are a result of a concatenation of diverse phenomena such as severe ecologic stress with environmental degradation, climate change, wars, or other catastrophic events causing enzootic pathogens to cross the species barrier and infect humans, with consequent spread catalyzed by human behavior, such as travel or large congregations. Sometimes outbreaks are caused by inadequate safety measures in laboratories. I will tell you that I had to deal with a lot of laboratory technicians inadvertently exposed to brucellosis because I don't know if any of you realize this, but sometimes laboratory technicians are fond of sniffing a plate, a culture plate with bugs growing on it, because some pathogens emanate specific odors that give you a clue as to what might be on the plate. Now, obviously, you can imagine that if you're growing brucellosis, which can be airborne, and you're sniffing that plate, you can easily get infected with brucellosis and you will have an outbreak amongst laboratory technicians. So I had to swing into action and give everybody prophylaxis for brucellosis to ensure that they did not come down with brucellosis. So we particularly make it a point to warn laboratory personnel that we are dealing with somebody who has a pathogen with a very high risk for infecting laboratory personnel. For example, coccidioidomycosis, brucellosis, anthrax, and so on and so forth. All right. Now, One Health. So rabies is a poster child for One Health. And we've been working in this for quite some time, and we showed that there were a lot of canines roaming around in India, by the way. In the past, it was estimated that 30,000 cases of rabies occur in India, and 95% of all Indian rabies is canine. And these are due to a large population of feral dogs, which continues to grow over the last 50 years, despite the efforts of the Indian agencies to control rabies by castrating dogs as well as immunizing dogs. And despite this, we continue to see an increase in the dog population because castration is an ineffective strategy for controlling dog populations. And the immunization of dogs has been less than adequate, particularly in rural areas. So now this was a very large study undertaken by ICMR that we participated in. We were in charge of the entire Telangana state. And what we found is that the number of cases of rabies has probably declined to maybe around 15,000, 20,000 per year in India. There continues to be a major problem with dog bites, but also bites by other animals such as monkeys and cats, etc. So the availability of control measures, such as the first responders' adequate response to managing a bite wound, such as washing it with copious amounts of soap water, immediately administering the vaccine or immune globulin, is suboptimal, particularly in rural areas. And we continue to see that rabies is a problem, except in the state of Goa, which has seen a greater than 90% reduction in rabies due to a One Health approach. One Health approach means you've got to address the dog population, you've got to address the access to humans to absolutely appropriate treatment for dog bites. Okay. It's amazing to me that most physicians who come out of training do not know that promptly washing a dog bite with copious amounts of soap water will lead to a 90% reduction of the risk of rabies. And thereafter, it has to be followed by the rabies vaccine, and if it's a high-risk bite, with concomitant rabies immune globulin. But if you have the right approach, you can certainly control rabies. In North America and Europe, rabies is essentially eliminated because all pets are immunized. But in addition to that, the sylvatic and zootic reservoir has been addressed by airdropping oral vaccine, which these animals then ingest and then are immunized against it. Now we have the technology to produce a safe, reliable oral vaccine that can be dropped in every area where there are canines, so the canines can all be immunized. But more importantly, we need to address the canine populations, because I'm sure all of you have seen newspaper reports where this bunch of dogs, feral dogs, have attacked either young children or old people and killed some of them. So the one clear way of reducing feral canine populations is to reduce litter and garbage, because dog populations are very sensitive to the availability of food. When there is no food available, the dogs auto-regulate the population automatically comes down. Now, let's look at some socio-economic, political impacts of recent things on health, okay? When the Bangladesh war broke out, we had major outbreaks of cholera in the refugee camps of Kolkata, 6 to 7 million people in camps. And when cholera hit, there was a 30% case fatality, 30%. They ran out of IV fluids within the first 24 hours. And this is when Mahalanobis and his colleagues suggested the use of oral rehydration solutions. By the way, their idea was poo-pooed by the great scientists sitting in Geneva, the WHO public health experts. Nevertheless, out of desperation, they tried oral rehydration solution and brought down the fatality to under 2%. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we had reemergence of diphtheria and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Due to war, polio that had been reduced enormously could not be continued to eradication in areas like Afghanistan, Nigeria, and even parts of Pakistan. We had threats of bioterrorism. We ignored throughout the 50s and 60s the slim disease in Africa because nobody cared about what happened to poor Black Africans until we discovered that this so-called slim disease was nothing other than the HIV pandemic. And you can see so on and so forth, the ongoing war in the Middle East continues to make eradication of poliomyelitis a big problem. There have been outbreaks of measles, cutaneous leishmaniasis, and so on and so forth. And this continues to this day. Now, what happens is pathogens can cross species barriers and cause human disease, especially when delicate ecological conditions are disrupted. Now, bats are a frequent source of pathogens like Nipah, rabies, etc. Why is that? Amazingly, it turns out that bats lack an appropriate NLRP3 response, and therefore they are able to tolerate all of these viruses. And in humans or other primates or mammals, NLRP3 is easily triggered by these viruses and kills people. So it's fundamentally a difference in the immunological response to a lot of pathogens. Therefore, some pathogens can remain enzootic and almost become part and parcel of the normal flora in animals. But when they cross the species barrier, they can cause havoc. So we've seen, how variants of the human immunodeficiency virus, such as the simian immunodeficiency virus, can exist in simian populations without causing major trouble. But when they crossed over to the humans, HIV-1 and HIV-2 emerged with devastating consequences. So also SARS, MERS, which came from civets and camels. We don't exactly know what the ecologic niche of COVID-19 is. As best as we understand, it still comes from the markets of Wuhan, where a lot of live animals are sold. But also, people have raised concerns of the potential for a laboratory leak because of unsafe laboratory practices in combination with what is called gain of function research. So how safe is this gain of function research? Basically, what the investigators there were doing is taking a lot of different coronaviruses and introducing mutations that caused a specific gain of function to see how that mutation or gain of function mutation would impact the pathogenesis of that particular pathogen. So this is the problem that we have, that a lot of pandemics that cause havoc in human civilizations are actually of zoonotic origin: SARS, H1, H5N1, MERS, H1N1, H7N9, COVID-19, Ebola, Mpox, plague, and then the vector-borne disease like Zika, yellow fever, then waterborne like cholera. So roughly, about 3/4 of all of these outbreaks in humans that cause trouble are of enzootic origin. Now, the other big plague that we are dealing with, antimicrobial resistance. Because of unenlightened use of antimicrobials, but largely actually in agriculture and animal husbandry and food production, pisciculture, where massive amounts of antibiotics. In fact, more than 90% of the use of antibiotics is non-human. And once you expose a population of pathogens to an antimicrobial agent, it may kill the majority of the population, but a minority will emerge because they're intrinsically resistant to that agent that we have used, and that remnant population then replaces the native population and is now causing disease with a completely drug-resistant population. And unfortunately, because all of these pathogens exist in our environment in multiple different species, some of which we use for food, animals, plants, etc., and we continue to use all of these agents, fertilizers, pesticides, and also antibiotics in animal production, that we can get infected with pathogens that are now completely drug resistant. I will tell you a recent phenomenon that I encountered personally. One of my cousins who had a little poultry farm was lamenting the fact that more than half of the chicken he had died. And then I asked him why. I said, I don't know, but in the village, many other people who have had poultry farms of varying sizes have had the same problem. So I asked him, what did you do? So, well, I called the vet. The vet gave some medication. So I said, show me the medications. And I see, to my horror, that these are doxycycline and other tetracycline derivatives, and also some quinolones. And I said, look, from what you're describing to me, this sounds like a viral outbreak because all of these birds started shaking and then they fell down, which sounds amazingly like a coronavirus that causes what we call, the bronchiolitis outbreak in chicken. By the way, the first coronavirus that was described of, the respiratory tract infections in poultry that were devastating poultry farms. This was in the 1930s. So I said, look, these antibacterial agents are unlikely to do anything that is desirable for your farm. So please desist. Simply cull out all the birds that you think may be potentially diseased or ill, and hope that the remaining birds will recover, and then you have a population that is disease-free and will propagate. And this time, be careful, don't bring in any other outside birds until you're certain that they don't harbor any diseases that will kill your poultry birds, all right? So what happens? We have all of these outbreaks, but we like to travel. So a pathogen that is infected somebody in Africa within hours is in the United States. As we recently heard in the news that there was somebody who had just returned from Africa and had what looked like an hemorrhagic fever disease, possibly due to Lassa fever. The other big pandemic that is underground and nobody talks about is microplastics. We have dumped millions of tons of plastic all over the world. There are islands of plastic floating in our oceans. Islands, literally, they are big, miles in diameter islands of floating plastic. Now, all of these are not biodegradable. They can break into small pieces, and then the marine animals ingest all of these microplastics. And eventually, all of these microplastics find their way into the human food chain. And you can see that in many human organs, people have varying amounts of microplastics in them. How we are going to address this catastrophic pandemic is beyond me. Now, what we need to understand is the implications of dealing with complex adaptive systems. So just a word about systems. A simple system is where there is an action and a reaction, very easy to calculate. A complicated system, on the other hand, has many different parts. Yet, if we can sit down and calculate the contribution of each and every individual constituent part, you can still understand and analyze the entire system. From there, you progress to what we call a complex system. A complex system is one where there are multiple agents interacting with each other, but these reactions are nonlinear, and also they exhibit what we call the Lorentz phenomenon or the Lorentz equation, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So a complex adaptive system is one where the interactions with each other are all nonlinear. It's a complex stochastic system with emergence, which is not completely predictable. All right. So here's a Lorentz equation. If you look at the upper side of the slide, you will see that when you start out with very small differences in the initial condition, within even just 12 seconds, the curve starts diverging. So a Lorentz equation is one where there is a very sensitive dependence on the initial conditions. So although there is a influence of what happens at the end of the initial conditions, it is not strictly deterministic in the sense that you cannot necessarily predict accurately exactly what the outcome is going to be. Now, Bircher and Hahn have suggested that health itself is a complex adaptive system where you have multiple different agents interacting with each other in a nonlinear fashion. There is an input, there is entropy, there is an output, there is work that is created. But within this entire system is what we call a strange attractor. And these strange attractors exhibit what we call the Lorentz equation. All right. Now, how does this impact on what we do in modeling and how we predict? So models are completely black box models where what goes on inside that box is completely unpredictable, okay? These are differential equations, stochastic matrix models. And then there is a white box model where it is a deterministic system in which you can calculate the contribution of individual agents, and therefore you can predict what is going to come out. And then there is a gray box model, which is in between the two different extremes. Now, how do we use all of these when we are thinking about predicting outcomes? So here's some more work that we did for the COVID pandemic. We first started out modeling what would happen in the population of Telangana, which is approximately 25 million. All right. So we assumed, and by the way, this was primarily forcing my colleagues to assume that the R, the basic reproductive rate, is 3, where everybody else was suggesting it was somewhere around 2, and I said no. From what I am seeing personally for the number of patients and how rapidly it's progressing, I said that the reproductive rate is 3. Let's make that assumption. So we use a simple compartmental model called a susceptible, infected, recovered model. And we suggested that in about a year's time, 36% of the population would be infected with COVID. This was a gross underestimate. We used a much more complex model called Asian-based modeling. Again, all of this is published. And again, I will tell you, even using an Asian-based modeling where the internal calculations are nonlinear, it's a very complex mathematical model. This is particularly, something that was popularized by the Santa Fe Institute, which has a Center for Complexity and Complex Equations, and they do a lot of modeling. And we use that particularly complex model. Don't ask me to explain the mathematics to you because I don't know, all right? But nevertheless, again, we fell short of making an accurate prediction of the total impact of the number of people who would get infected and what would happen. So there is just an illustration of the shortcomings of all of these modeling methods that we have. Now let's look at something else very interesting. Typically when people are predicting something, they use what we call the normal distribution, which means that there is a central tendency. Most of the events are occurring around the mean, and there's a small number of occurrences occurring around the tails of the normal distribution, which is a bell-shaped curve. Now, people like Nassim Nicholas Taleb have suggested that that is a flawed approach. And he shows that particularly when you are modeling what happens to COVID pandemic and the spread of COVID pandemics, if you make the assumption that moving from a population of N to a population that is twice N or 3 times N, you cannot say that the number of COVID cases or deaths will be twice or 3 times. In fact, as the population increases, the number of cases and the number of deaths actually go up exponentially, as is shown in these graphs. And you can see on the x-axis, the population that's going up, and on the y-axis, the frequency of cases and the frequency of deaths. And you can see clearly that the number of cases and the number of deaths are going up exponentially when you look at the increase in population. Why does this happen? This is what is called a power law distribution. What is a power law distribution? It says that where a relative change in one quantity results in a proportional relative change in the other quantity, independent of the initial size of these quantities, one quantity varies as a power of another. For instance, considering the area of a square in terms of the length of its size, if the length is doubled, the area is multiplied by a factor of 4. And amazingly, the COVID pandemic followed exactly this law. It followed the power law distribution, which is part of the reason why when you have certain pandemics, once you reach a critical population density, and then you add on a lot of other factors such as travel and mingling, you can see that the impact on denser population is exponentially increased. So here's another logistic map equation. And what the logistic map equation is used for is in modeling how a population grows, whether it's a human population, animal population, or pathogen population. So as long as the R is under 1, okay, the population will die out. Okay. In between 2 and 3, the population will approach the same value of R minus 1 by R, but it will fluctuate around that value. When the rate of convergence is linear, except for an R of 3, which is slow, less than linear, all right? In between 3 and 3.44, from almost all initial conditions, the epidemic or the population will fluctuate up, down, up, down. And that's precisely what happened in pandemic. Remember, the first year and the second year, we had an increase and then a decline. And then the second round hit, we had an increase and a decline. And pretty much same thing happened with a smaller magnitude in the third year, probably as a result of control measures that were introduced, including vaccination. All right. Once the R increases beyond 3.5, it can go to a chaotic situation where it's completely unpredictable and nobody can tell what's going to happen. So what we say, and this is the thing that, all of us, shall we say, slipped and fell. we had all of these arguments about whether COVID is airborne or droplet. And to me, that was an entirely sterile debate because I said, I don't know, and I don't care. What is mathematically absolutely irrefutable is proximity is the most important cause of spread. And I kept on saying, and I continue to maintain to this date, that the entire strategy of building large public health hospitals where we will take care of the entire infected groups in large congregation was the stupidest thing that we could have done, because one could predict that proximity being the biggest risk factor for contagion, that if you concentrated a large population of COVID infected people in a small space, particularly in hospitals that are poorly ventilated, that you will cause so much spread that even a full PPE with a 95% reduction in contagion will be totally inadequate. You will overwhelm that very easily. And that, to me, is the explanation, the mathematical explanation of why so many healthcare professionals got infected with COVID and so many of them died. This is I still maintain, and I'm sorry I'm being so strident and, shall we say, harsh about it, stupidity beyond belief. I'll tell you, I personally took care of over 600 patients with COVID during the 2 years, 2021 and going into 22 also. And I kept everybody home. Even when they were hypoxic, I said, stay at home, use a home oxygenator, use dexamethasone. You go to a hospital, they'll kill you. They'll give you high-dose methylprednisolone, and you will get mucormycosis or some other stupid hospital-acquired infection, and you'll die. And my entire cohort of 600 people, very few, maybe 2 or 3 people got hospitalized, and only 2 people died. But these were people who were already hospitalized by the time I had gotten to them, and they had severe underlying heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, renal failure, and so on and so forth. Everybody else survived. And what's most interesting is I have no long COVID cases in my cohort, even today. So what this tells us is, let's not get into sterile debates about how things happen and how things don't happen. What is abundantly clear is if you use the basic principles of epidemiology and mathematical modeling, it will give you some insight into what can potentially happen. So I will tell you, a very high replication rate, very high transmissibility, high genetic heterogeneity with rapid evolution of quasi-species leads to uncontrollable pandemics with a very high mortality. And COVID, you can tick off every one of these items there. Very high replication rate, very high transmissibility. And that transmissibility, I will still say that talking about whether it's airborne or droplets is a sterile debate. What you should focus on is proximity. It is very clear, proximity increases contagion. Very high genetic heterogeneity. And in fact, all of the coronaviruses exhibit this factor because they have any RNA virus which has a very high replication rate. And even if they have what we call the reparative mechanisms, they do not have the ability to prevent a genetic heterogeneity to arise. Okay, so they become a quasi-species very rapidly. And this is the reason why I predicted that antiviral agents like remdesivir would not be particularly effective, maybe of marginal impact in all of these people. And the same thing with the newer agents, the protease inhibitor and so on and so forth that Pfizer makes and sells. The body itself controls COVID population within about 3-4 days. The trouble is, the reason why people die is not due to the persistence of the pathogen, but due to the triggering of irreversible inflammatory reactions, particularly mediated by NLRP3, which led to the vast majority of cases of deaths, coupled with our own inability to accurately phenotype people. Which COVID patient has a macrophage activation syndrome, which COVID patient has, what is known as damage due to the pulmonary vasculature due to in situ thrombosis or vasculitis of the pulmonary system and so on and so forth. And that really led to, a broad strokes, brush strokes of everybody getting quote unquote potent anti-inflammatory agents with the naive assumption that higher doses of steroids would be better than lower doses of steroids. And when we kept arguing with people that, look, that was counterintuitive, there's nothing in the pathophysiology of macrophage activation syndromes that suggests that higher doses of steroids are better than lower doses of steroids. And it wasn't until multiple studies were done to show that, in fact, higher doses of steroids were not more beneficial than lower dose steroids. If lower doses of steroids hadn't worked, we had to move to something else like tocilizumab or a JAK inhibitor and so on and so forth. So this is a concatenation of events again, a failure to understand the basic epidemiology, a failure to understand basic pathophysiology at a molecular level, and this all converges into what I call suboptimal clinical response to patients who are ill. And again, at a policy level, epidemiologically, and at a country level or a state level, a completely irrational response to the pandemic. What can you do about it? Well, there are many different ways of integrating large amounts of data. We are in the era of big data. And particularly if you take big data and combine machine learning with neural networks, you can possibly come up with many more different scenarios, some of which you would not have thought about by yourself. Unfortunately, even these fall short, as I will tell you. So it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. This is what Niels Bohr and Yogi Berra says. Basically, what it means is that making predictions is not a great science, okay? So natural phenomena, dynamic, complex adaptive systems where multiple agents have interactions that are nonlinear or chaotic with sensitive dependence on initial conditions, with the system as a whole being non-deterministic, with emergence of phenomena beyond human control. So even then, we can try. We can do integrating big data, machine learning, neural networks, genetic algorithms, understanding outbreaks, using predictive analytics for risk mitigation, quantum computing, advanced techniques for iterative trial and error to avoid massive catastrophic failure. So the idea here is that no matter what we try, there is a probability of success. There is also a probability of failure. What we want to guard against is a fatal mistake or a catastrophic failure, all right? But it is imperative to keep trying different things without any preconceived notions or presumptions or assumptions. So coming back to Nassim Nicholas Taleb, one of my favorite authors, and he is famous for writing about the black swan. And the bottom line, what he argues is that, listen, in predictive analytics, people use the normal distribution where most of the events clustered around the center of the distribution, the mean. And that is not an appropriate way of mathematically dealing with predictions. What happens? Okay, now let's go back to India. Let's recognize that 60% of India's population is rural. Very little access to decent health services. 70% of India's children are malnourished in 2024. HIV, tuberculosis, metabolic syndrome, big threat. So what I continue to say, and I've been saying this for the last 3 decades, economic collapse will fuel the spread of extremist fringe ideologies. And evolution of fringe ideologies into overt criminality is inevitable. And this constitutes a security threat to India and the entire free world. Why? Because when you have bad things happening, whether they are pandemics or catastrophes of nature, whatever it is, immediate survival takes precedence over investment for the future. There's a shift away from labor-intensive crops, vegetables. It curtails a variety and nutritional value of the diet. The debt burden of the family goes up. Women and children lose inheritance when the head of the household dies. And the transgenerational transfer of capital is halted. What is transgenerational transfer of capital? I will tell you that my great-grandfather was a semi-literate carpenter. My grandfather was the first educated man in the family, went to a school because of the kindness of his teacher who gave him some money to buy books. So a little scholarship, and he studied under street lamps. He became an engineer. He ensured that his children had access to education. My father got his master's from Rourkela, which has now become an IIT, was the first person in our family to go abroad, leave the country. And his son, myself, sitting here talking to you as a full professor. That's transgenerational capital. So let's see what we should be doing, okay? What we need to do, how do we shape the future? And the future may be in collaborative surveillance, detection, characterization, understanding dynamics, impact measurement, monitoring, and evaluation. It must have certain features. Number one, it is tailored to address public health issues in a given context, contributing to decision-making for action. Two, it builds on strengthened existing surveillance mechanisms for known risks. Number three, it involves people and communities. To me, this is particularly important. I would actually place this first. Four, it leverages new technologies and innovative approaches. I would actually place this the last. I think that the seduction of technology is dangerous. It should be grounded in effective health delivery systems. A measure of social justice is imperative. It links local, subnational, national, regional, and global surveillance efforts. It's based on a clear consensus framework of sharing data ethically. Remember, when the Wuhan outbreak occurred, China actually kept the whole thing under wraps for weeks, all right, until it was forced by a global consensus to release data. Number eight, it stands on sustainable, scalable financing and trained human resources. Number nine, it's coordinated and overseen and strengthened by an empowered national program and health control. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that what we need to do is to go to the principles of one health and one planet at a community level where we integrate everything, the health of the environment, the health of animals, and the human health, all put together in a participatory action project. And we've actually launched that. It's called Happen, where we are addressing, communities by improving their health literacy, encouraging ownership of their health, networking all of them so there is a free flow of information, and also asking them to be active participants and owners of their own health metrics. So I think what we need to do is focus more on becoming what Nassim Nicholas Taleb calls becoming anti-fragile. Understand that we cannot necessarily predict all of the bad things that will happen. Black swans will occur. But what we need to do is prepare ourselves to address them, respond to them, and above all, keep on trying small experiments to see what happens and ensure that we have the necessary resilience to overcome and survive a major catastrophic event, whether it is an infectious disease pandemic, or it's a volcano, or it's an earthquake, or, God forbid, it's nuclear warfare. So I continue to maintain that power is an illusion, authority is a delusion, and responsibility is reality. We, the healthcare science professionals, have a responsibility. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Yaldandi, for a very insightful and an amazing talk. You took us back into history, right to the very recent pandemic, and gave us a good insight into what was done. And I think none of us can predict what the next pandemic is going to be, but certainly there are key lessons that we've learned from COVID-19. And if I may, there are no questions in the chat box, so I wanted to ask you a question. Building readiness for the next pandemic, whatever it may be. Right now we're seeing mpox, and the spread has occurred from, it's brewing in the DRC, but it's spreading slowly. We see India and we see Thailand being affected. What are we doing to build readiness? It has to be global, just because we are at that cusp of not only climate change, but we're also at the cusp of wars. We travel everywhere. There's a lot of that, and we are uniquely poised right now to enter into another different pandemic. So what are we doing to build readiness, first of all in India, and then maybe if you could address also globally what we could do to build readiness?
So I think
protect
the first thing is we should go back to the same paradigm that I quoted, understand history. Mpox is not a new virus. It's been around for a long time. And we know that this is, again, an enzootic agent that crossed the species barrier. The question we should ask ourselves is, why did it disappear from our consciousness for so many decades? All right. And very interesting, smallpox vaccination. The moment we eradicated smallpox by vaccinating everybody, Mpox disappeared. That's why I tell people I'm not going to get Mpox. I'm not worried about it because I was inoculated against smallpox as a child, and that immunity is long lasting. So the obvious answer was that technology is available. In fact, unfortunately, today there are two laboratories, one in the United States and one in Russia, that still have viable smallpox viruses in their laboratories. And, we know that a few decades ago, the United States Army was vaccinating all soldiers against smallpox because of a concern of it being used as a biowarfare agent. So the answer is very clear. It's vaccine. So we need to once again think about, vaccinating travelers and say, look, just as we vaccinate you for meningococcus if you're going to the Middle East, if you're going to a hyper-endemic area like the Africas, take the Mpox vaccine. There is a candidate vaccine already out there, and we need to do about it. Now, what are we doing? Unfortunately, we are talking and doing nothing. And again, we are going back to the same old thing. Oh, we are going to control people coming in. We are going to surveillance people coming in and out. And this is all sheer nonsense. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm being harsh, but, look, again, my problem is that in India in particular, public health policy is not directed by people who actually have some experience in epidemiology and understand basics of infectious diseases, microbiology, and the basic sciences. But then why should I fault public health, policymakers, the politicians? The vast majority of infectious disease clinicians don't understand it. And they, along with the pulmonologists, are also guilty of poisoning so many people with COVID at high-dose steroids. Amazing. Think about hydroxychloroquine. Think about ivermectin, right? So when our own colleagues in the health sciences have such poor insight into how we go about thinking about a rational approach to a problem, why should we blame policymakers who are politicians primarily?
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Ravi Kohli has put in a question in the chat box. He says, power is an illusion, authority is delusion, responsibility is reality. Well said. Who said it? Yourself, Dr. Y? It's so true.
Guilty as charged.
All right. Anybody else in the audience with any questions? I don't see any in the chat box. So I will wrap this up and send it back to Dr. Govil and Dr. Katula.
Thank you, Dr. Yaldandi, for that eloquent talk and, with history background. And that's really, delivered. And Dr. Kamposhkal for moderating the event. And I have a question, Dr. Yaldandi. Where did you get all those pictures from? I mean, those are all very nicely done.
Generative AI.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just want to make sure.
I gave the design parameters and it generated
Yeah,
the image.
they look really good. I mean, it's amazing.
Beautiful.
So,
Absolutely.
thank you. So, we'll just do the honors to Dr. Vijay Yaldandi for his contribution to the CME webinar series. Skodali, please, yeah, there you go. So this is a small token of appreciation for Dr. Vijay Eldandi. American Association of Physicians of Indian Origin recognizes Vijay Eldandi, MD, FSC, PFCP, FIDSA for his outstanding contributions in the field of infectious diseases and welcomes as a member of AAPI Distinguished Speakers Club. Satish Kathula, AAPI President, Amit Goel, Chair, AAPI CME Committee, November 13, 2024. Thank you so much, Dr. Yaldandi, again.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for allowing me to expound on one of my favorite topics. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's very well delivered, and we appreciate that. And to all the attendees, thank you so much. And try to get your CME credit for this. And then we'll have another CME webinar coming up next week, next Wednesday. So please attend. And I really appreciate all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Thank you, Dr. Yaldandi. Thank you. Really appreciate it.